That way people know we're.
Yep, we're up there.
Okay, great.
Directly.
I just let them know we're on Facebook and YouTube, and if they can. All right, so I think we're live right now, Patrick. We're live on YouTube and on Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
And we can get if we can get a confirmation from Brianna, Jamie, just to make sure that
You are, I see, right?
we're good. Just the volume, make sure we're working on the volume. Yeah, we're just waiting to come up live right now. All right. Well, looks like we are live. All right, we're live, James. So this is the Indicators of Compromise, week 2 of our 100-day leadership challenge, and we're alternating offense and defense as we go. And this week we're going to focus on defense innovation. And I think Indicators of Compromise is a good one, as a lot of our customers, a lot of CIOs, a lot of CISOs are working from home now. They have distributed workforces. Everybody is working from home. So it's a really good one to ask questions about. Everybody's been postulating about what's it going to be like to work in a cloud. Everybody says, well, a lot of people say, oh, I'm fully cloud, and it's a cloud first world. And well, now our hands are being forced that way. So what is an indicator of compromise? Maybe that is a good way to start today. Like, what is an indicator of compromise to you, James?
Well, from one point of view, what we're looking at is an official indicator of compromise is once someone's been hacked or had a malware and they get a forensics team in there, they start releasing indicator of compromise information or material. And so typically what we see is that this results in a list of IP addresses, files, and
go back for a second. So someone thinks they're hacked,
right,
and so they call in essentially
a forensics team.
Organization. And sometimes we do that for folks, right? And so you call in, and it could be some of the bigger names in the industry come in, and so what do they do, and what do you see some of the outputs?
So the output, as a good example, because we've seen a couple from the big guys, is realistically it's a spreadsheet. And that spreadsheet is literally a list of files with MD5 hashes, IP addresses, and domain names. So it's really only 3 things. Now, there's a lot of other forensics work involved, but at the end of the day, when you're passing along, here's a compromise, and to see if you have this compromise that your buddy down the street got, look for these things, right? So it's items to look for. What we find is interesting is it's really basic data, right? Domain names are pretty basic. IP addresses are pretty basic. And when we look at kind of the concept of you should see if this is affecting you too, we have the issue that now everybody's out of the data center and out of corporate and not behind their firewalls anymore. So it becomes a lot more difficult to say, okay, Bill, the sales guy sitting at home, is he hitting any of these websites, or is he hitting any of these IP addresses, or does he have any of these files? It's a lot more difficult. And it's also very reactive, right? It's already happened, and now you're seeing if you've got this data flow or files, and basically it's way too late, right? Because at that point you've already got it, you're already infected, and you're just confirming the fact that you're infected. You're not really preventing
So
anything.
that's an interesting place to, well, let me, we're live now and we're good to go. We're good to go, team? Yep, okay. So for those of you listening, there's going to be a couple ways for you to interact with James and I today. And you can put your comments in the feed on YouTube or Facebook feed. We get to see those live and the team will condense those and bring them to James and I's attention. Or you can text my phone number, which is streaming at the bottom there as you listen to James and I, or you can, it's the 410-320-6433. And you can text that number and or you can call it. That'd be great too. And some of you may want to just call in with a question, and that'd be awesome. Like a good old fashioned talk show, and then James and I will field the question from there. So this is our first foray into live events, and it's going to be first of many because we think this format is great because security is not standing still, and these ideas have to get out to everybody listening. And so to build on what you just said, James, I think part of this complexity is trying to solve what problem we're trying to solve for. Are we trying to solve for the historical what just happened, who done it,
Mhm.
or are we actually trying to block something from happening? And maybe we can break it into two different discussion points.
Yeah, and it depends who you are. So what we notice is large companies are mostly looking for the whodunit piece, which is a shame because they're skipping over the block it so it doesn't happen in the first place. All of the mid-sized and smaller companies want to get looking for that more bang for your buck. They're trying to block it so that they don't have to worry about whodunit.
Sure.
And so there's been some recent hacks that we've got some material for the indicators of compromise. And what we found is interesting is most of our mid-sized and smaller clients that have been doing the security things we're recommending actually would have caught all of the indicators of compromise before it infected them. Whereas the large organizations, there's more politics involved in security purchasing there. They're doing the historics, hiring the big consulting firms to tell them about the indicators of compromise and skipping right over the fact that they could have blocked it. If they had put the right materials in place, they could have blocked it.
But it's also, but I would say that part of the governance GRC, the governance risk and compliance side is there's a chunk of everybody listening, of all of our listeners that have to deal with the GRC side. So they have to be able to answer the question historical, and they have to be able to find the cookie crumbs and be able to reverse and find who done it. But we also have to, I think that's been the solo focus versus what you're saying is that we can architect it such that it's sort of blocking up front and you can get both. Are we saying you can get one or the other, or are you saying you can get both?
I mean, with a large enough budget, you can always get both. With a smaller budget, technically you can concentrate on the blocking, and then forensics team can kind of put together the picture after the fact if the blocking doesn't work. So you have a mix there. And of course, that's a volatile opinion, I know. But at the same time, if we look at since Corona started and we had some of the defense events, and we talked about good solutions to put in place as people disperse. What's interesting there is we talked about OpenDNS. We've talked for years about things like GeoIP and botnet filtering on firewalls. We've talked about next-gen AV with sandboxing and capture client. And so one of the more recent data sets we got, what I found interesting is all of the data we received would have been caught by those.
So you're saying the data set from the forensics activity that you received from the data set that we were looking at that would have been caught if they had done a blocking approach up front.
Correct.
Okay.
And so that really comes down to what do you do with indicators of compromise. So what we like to do with it is figure out would the solutions have blocked it, and do we have the right solutions, and how do we prevent the next one? And looking at that more proactive approach to security. If we look at this from the point of view of what layers would help, we have things like capture client, right? Sandboxing, figuring out if it's a zero-day malware. A lot of these things are what appears to me to be zero-day malware related, right?
Yeah.
So if we're running them in a proper advanced sandbox, we're going to catch, whether it be a side channel attack or some spurious communication coming out of it, that's going to prevent you from, one, getting the files. If we look at it from the OpenDNS aspect or that DNS security aspect, what we have here is hitting domains that should have never been hit in the first place. OpenDNS has that follow me security that we've been talking about. And so whether they're in the company or at home or at Starbucks, wherever, that would have followed them and prevented that phone home or being able to go hit and download the next virus, if you will.
So, and for those of you listening that can submit questions to the number that is streaming that we can field, a lot of these security terms we hear quite a bit. So I might not ping James for sandboxing your ATP and DNS security, following protection and such. And those are some of the questions that you want to put into the YouTube or Facebook, however you're watching this, or text. And we can get into more detail on that. Go ahead.
We do actually have our first question from Jason. He's asking, what do you guys make of the iPhone Mail app vulnerability that was released?
Which one? How many times? And
iPhone. Who's using iPhones?
I kind of laugh about that, but the first thing that we make of it is iPhone devices, iOS devices need blanket security, period. I know there's always a belief that we run into that iOS is more secure than Android or Microsoft. I know a week or two ago, we had talked about it and done a release thing that Apple was in the middle of releasing like 30 vulnerabilities, and I think it was 7 of them were vulnerabilities caused by their last vulnerability patch. So realistically, our thoughts on the iOS side is they need the same security as everything else. It's important, I think, that we assume all platforms are equally susceptible to some kind of malware, some kind of attack, or some type of just overall takeover and intrusion.
So do you? But let's talk about this, because this is an important one, James. You and I were working on this last week. Jason, his comment here. So Jason, I know he's got some very sophisticated endpoint security, and now we have everybody at home, and then everybody's now using not just corporate approved machines, but they've got their iPhones. I've got an iPhone and Android, they've got tablets, kids' machines, and at some level, we're now we don't have to care, or we shouldn't care as much about managing all the different platforms and be able to just manage the outcome we want to get.
We definitely have to do a mix.
Okay.
One of the things that we've seen when talking with clients is the proliferation of uncontrolled devices, or people who are saying, okay, working on my laptop was great for the first week, but I have this desktop with 3 screens downstairs, so now I'm going to work on it instead. And now they're on an uncontrolled device using 365, or they're on an iPad and wandering around their house instead of sitting in front of a screen while they're working. It's definitely a real risk. When we talk about next-gen antivirus, in this case, I was referring to it on the PCs or Macs, and that's important from an endpoint point of view. But we now have to very much worry about the uncontrolled endpoints, and so that's going to come really more along the lines of API-based security into things like Gmail and 365 and Salesforce and Slack and Box and OneDrive and all that kind of good stuff, because that's what's going to be important. So, for example, if we look at this latest compromise, one of the things they were able to do was, in this example, lift administrator credentials, right? And so who is probably the worst at having random iPads for testing and other purposes is probably administrators and executives, right? People with a lot of credential rights. And so what we need to make sure of, if there is a 0-day, well, how is that iPad really protected from a 0-day? Or more importantly, that iPad is hooked up with your 365. It downloads a malware that doesn't affect the iPad, but it does drop into your 365 environment. And so now that's being tunneled into, let's say, your sync directory on your PC, and you're bypassing a lot of security there. So getting into that API approach is really how I think people can kind of bolster their protection against these uncontrolled devices, because you can't control their DNS and you can't control their pieces of them.
And there's some sophisticated, we're recording this?
Yeah.
Okay, that's cool. I mean, not here, but on the stream?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So one of the things, I had a really great conversation. There's some real sophisticated security buyers, and there's others, there's different continuum. It's like some people are super strong and have big muscles, and some, just aren't as strong. So we have a different continuum of maturity level within security. But I had this great conversation with the guy about financial services yesterday. I mean, just complete utter stacks of layering of technologies. But then all of a sudden we got to, he wants to move aggressively into Azure. And he wants to, it still has on-prem. I knew why his on-prem email because of compliance reasons, and he knew he could control it, but he wants to move into Azure, and he wants to move over to 365. And APIs came up, and this was an area he hadn't really heard about and explored, was API-based security and what that means, what that is. He's like, I need to know about that, because he's like, I just want to know, because I am paranoid, because I've made really good investments, but I just want to know what's next. And I think this is a good one for listeners to know what's next that we're seeing in API. Maybe you can explain a little bit more about that.
Sure. So with the API security, there's the kind of industry way to use it, which is you've got a security system. We use SonicWall CAS ourselves that's integrated into things like Google and 365 and all of that. But there's also a new component, which is custom applications and self-developed applications. And so we're seeing, especially in this new distributed arrangement, people are trying to bring up websites where they can custom take information from customers, maybe drop files, project plans, what have you, but they're trying to integrate it with, let's say, their project management system or their member management system or their Workday. And so what's interesting is good CAS systems, you can actually build into that security into your custom app as well. And so let's say if you're a credit union and you're taking loan applications inside your loan system, you have an opportunity there to add a layer of protection right at that web application layer or that API layer, even if it's in Azure or on-prem, doesn't really matter, so that you get that same effect as you would if you're rolling out something like CAS into the 365 environment. And then what's great about that is, let's say it's a customer who's infected. You have absolutely no control over that, but you have a spot where they can upload documents to you. They might be unwittingly, uploading documents that are very dangerous, but you're now distributed. So you've got people on iPads trying to service membership or customers, hitting that website. So you're never really coming through all of the traditional security in the data center. If we have that level of integration, then we can make sure that as it kind of loops from the outside back to the outside, never really coming inside, that you get a chance to grab, inspect, detonate those things in a same box.
So basically, it's I don't even like when I use the word shim, but essentially for the walks into Google infrastructure or AWS or into 365, whatever, it runs through inspection, third-party inspection via an API. And I talked about this in the book Exponential Organizations, is that this was 4 years ago I started talking about this, that CIOs really and CISOs need to really dominate APIs in the cloud-based world. And we're just talking about the security APIs, not talking about business intelligence or any of the other use of APIs and feeds.
Yeah, and so we don't use the word shim, like you said, because a shim represents a gateway, typically. Okay. So for us, if we're securing an API, let's say we're running some kind of system where we have a REST API that we can share with our customers. That we would be protecting with, for example, a web application firewall system. And that's a front end where you do shim it so that it loops through that before it gets to your API, so people can't suck all your data out or hack you and pretend to be different customers, things like that. And so you're protecting the application with a shim on the web application firewall. On the API, you're not protecting the application as much as the data, and you're not shimming as much as getting a little tap feed in there. Not so much from the back, but think of it as
like a tap,
old-fashioned tap. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly, an IDS tap. And so you're tapping to the side so that they're not looping through you. And so both of them are important.
If you listen,
Yeah, Jim.
like I am, go figure that out.
I think we built half those things with Jim already, so he's good to go for his pieces. But all of those are important, and so when you look at an indicator of compromise, you have to look at it from all of those directions of, do I already have this?
Yeah, right.
How do I make sure I don't get infected from the services I'm presenting to people? And then how do I make sure I don't get infected by using the services people present to me? So you have to look at it in kind of all three directions. And often you have to have a solution for each direction. There's not a good universal solution out there. They just don't exist.
Hey, Patrick, I'm going to share this. I'm going to share my my screen here.
Okay.
I'm hoping that it pops up. Can you see that?
It's got a.
No, it's good. It's good. It'll come up or it won't. But I think that the Azure in AWS is interesting because we've talked about the securing SaaS applications and so you have this web application. And this is where this interesting skills gap comes up. Even with the gentleman I talked to yesterday, that I would say represents some of our more sophisticated CIOs, and he wants to move aggressively into Azure and AWS, but there's a bit of a skills gap, and which is normal. I mean, when cars supplanted horses, there was a skills gap to learn what the motors of the cars were. So, so we've got web application firewalls to protect backend resources, and we're looking at these as endpoints, right?
Correct.
So it's not just an iPhone or a laptop. These are endpoints in this distributed computing environment. And so how would you, as you talk about APIs, you talk about a shim approach, the web application firewall would be a traditional shim. API would be, how would you refer to that in a cloud? Would that be inspecting a stream?
So that would be inspecting the stream from the side versus making the stream flow through you as a shim.
Okay.
So that would be the real difference. And we do consider them endpoints. So one of the most popular calls we get is people who are worried because their developers got hacked and they want to know, does that have an impact on the website that developers were creating? And we've seen a number of cases where the answer was, oh, yes, very much so. The worst one we saw was where the developer used the same root password to every single client they had. And so one little hack at the developer side took out every customer they had. That was a few years ago. If we look at some of the ones now, they really are endpoints. So the risk here is, if the developer catches something, or if you're content editor, let's say you're pushing content editing out to Upwork or one of those other pieces, and that person's sitting there on a completely unsecured Mac that they like to pirate audio and video and on movies and stuff with because they like to make pictures and things like that. If they are infected and they're pushing files and text and HTML into your website, there's a real potential that they could infect you. And so that's why we treat those as endpoints. And in a lot of environments, that same stack we talk about for that floating sales rep who's sitting, never comes to the office and has a couple of layers with the next gen AV and things like that. We do the same thing for those endpoints out in Azure as an example to say, okay, is there a firewall? Is there OpenDNS? Is there Capture Client on those guys? And we want it not because they're users, but because users still touch them.
Yeah.
And so if that developer does infect them with something like Maze or malware or something along those lines, it's got to try to do something once it's in their environment. And those layers are still really effective at ensuring they can. And so for most of the calls that we get and people say, well, what do we do about that? There's not a good way to make yourself bulletproof against that developer. By definition, and not speaking on developers, any kind of administrative help there. They're administrators. They're going to be able to put files on the system. They're going to play with encrypted files. There's a risk there that you can't mitigate. So what you have to mitigate is the risk that says, okay, if it is compromised or they do unleash something in there, how do I make sure it doesn't get out and it gets killed as quickly as possible and it doesn't spread? Because they're spreading internally, which means that site is used to hop to get to the rest of your corporate. But then don't forget, there's also the impact of your site is now a toxic site, right? And you're spreading malware to other people. That's another big impact as well. And so those same solutions we talk about preventing people from hacking in also prevents you from basically hacking out.
So basically, if you're pretending like you've been compromised, that's probably the healthiest perspective being, because you put the correct technologies behind the scenes so that you know when you've been hacked. that's actually different. That's a different mental approach. Let me pause for a moment. Do we have any emails that have come in or any phone calls? Well, we're going to look up now. If anybody has any questions or any text that you can submit to us, we'll take inbound calls if you want to just do that at 410-320-6433, or you can submit any questions like Jason did earlier. But that's an interesting mental flip, James, if we look at, if you pretend that you will be hacked, you're going to put, what type of technologies will you put behind the scenes that, we'll just talk about different types of tools and the names of those tools. What will we put behind to make sure that we know if we have a friendly, like a developer that's made a mistake, or we have an unfriendly?
Well, and part of it comes down to the old-fashioned concept of trust but verify. Even if you have a solution, is it doing anything useful? Now, we know from our years of auditing systems that half the time, just because there's a firewall doesn't mean it's doing anything.
Right.
Or the firewall will be out at Azure, and the idea will be there's no users, so we don't really have to harden that firewall as much as we do our user firewall. And in reality, you do, because if those servers start acting like users, you're already dead. You're already compromised at that point. So you have to have that assumption. So is it doing anything useful? And then think of all the really big hacks that we've heard about on the news. And then we always hear about how they had these SIEM systems and these special socks and all of these really expensive third parties. You never really hear about that they had all the standard blocking pieces that they should have, mostly because adding some of those pieces requires effort, right? You're interfering, so you're going to get the call from the CEO that says, I can't get to this site, or I can't do this. And so what we're doing is we're trading that.
What you're saying is that if I harden, if I'm in Azure and I make sure I have either a virtual firewall or a physical firewall, and you're securing outbound protection there, super important, but it's going to be something which you have to tune, because not all ports are treated equally. So you're gonna have to tune that firewall. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, because it also has to look at SSL.
Yeah.
Okay, so is it still, they saying 70% of traffic is SSL, or 60%?
I think the last I heard was like 82.
82% of traffic is SSL, so you got to actually inspect SSL. Okay. What
And
about,
that's both leaving your environment and entering your environment. You need to inspect it, because you can get hit either way.
okay, so an endpoint actually, it's funny, so your endpoints can actually be protected by making a focus on the firewall. Who would have thought that, right? I mean, that's really what you're saying.
And everything is an endpoint now. I mean,
Yeah.
absolutely everything's an endpoint. Another good example is we had a client with an AS400, and everyone tends to think AS400s can't be hacked because they don't do anything useful from a networking aspect. Except almost every single one of them has an old Samba share that has hard-coded usernames and password that touch every computer that goes in and out of them. So it's a wonderful place to mine data to hack everything else. So it's very easy to kind of subvert that. So we have to look at everything, whether it's an old box, actual Unix AIX box that was safe, because all of them can be really used at this point against someone. Okay. And so we really have to make sure that we're securing from all angles, more so than anything else, and have the approach of trusting nothing. The amount of times we've seen where someone has AWS or an Azure environment, and because there's no users there, it's treated as a trusted site that's safe, and then has a VPN with no inspection tunneling straight back to the local area network. That's insane. It can take one single administrative error done by generally speaking, a developer, not an IT operations person, and that's now published on the internet.
So classic. So instead of having, so essentially, it's just taking a machine at Azure or AWS and then forming a IPsec tunnel, traditional classic VPN, straight back home, running back home. What you're saying is build that into a third-party firewall, and then create a third-party firewall to third-party firewall connection. Just use some classic data center techniques. Classic data in. But you joke about this quite a bit, but I think you have a shirt that says the cloud is someone else's data center.
Absolutely, yeah. The cloud is just someone else's computer, and you have to treat it that way. I mean, you really do, because you never know what's going in there. And one of the benefits of the cloud is scaling and getting external people, internal people into the cloud and making sure that you can move really fast. You can still do all of that with security. You just have to make sure that just like a normal data center, you're securing at least that edge. So that they're coming through a real firewall, and then they can run amok inside all they want with spinning up, spinning down boxes, Kubernetes clusters, expandables, all that kind of stuff.
Let's talk about that, because in some of the, not knowing where everybody is from the listener base, but knowing some of the questions that I'm getting about Azure and AWS from a cloud. And so as you're looking at, we talked about firewall, we talked about a web application firewall. What about behind, when we're talking about lateral protection and just doing hunting, good old fashioned hunting? I know some of the tools we're using, like SonicWall and AlertLogic and like Microsoft ATA and things of that nature, and using those in different environments. How would someone approach that? How could someone approach those as endpoints? Like, would you break hunting from blocking and talk about them separately?
Yeah, I would separate blocking from hunting, because you definitely want to mix.
Okay.
That said, what we found is the solutions we use, SonicWall, AlertLogic, OpenDNS as an example, run equally good in the cloud as they do on-prem.
Sure.
And so we don't have to have different solutions on-prem and in the cloud and in the colo. So because that would just be kind of solution sprawl and everything would be different, very hard to troubleshoot or protect anything. But we want to make sure we have different layers. So for example, you don't want a firewall that claims it'll do absolutely everything. You want to make sure there's sub-products in there, which is definitely what we look at for that. And the other piece that we want to ensure is some of it also is going to come down to security process. So you mentioned Microsoft Advanced Threat Analytics. We love that thing. Some of the compromises recently, ATA would have caught that, same as the really expensive SIEM systems would have caught it. And so when I can sit there and say, oh, great, the thing that came free with my enterprise mobility suite would have been just as effective at catching it as these really expensive SIEM-based solutions.
Yeah.
Because from what I've seen, they absolutely did. But the other thing that becomes interesting, we're looking at one IOC, and it's talking about really lame stuff. It's talking about running BAT files from the 80s. It's talking about running, files that shouldn't be allowed to run. And so you have to look at an environment and say, how did this even run in the first place? And so that's where it becomes.
Why was it one BAT file?
Old-fashioned administrator logon scripts, for example.
So the administrator is using just an old technique, but what would be flagged as would normally be flagged as a hack. But it's an administrator.
James wants to answer that one.
Correct, and it makes it to the point where you can't necessarily draw a line between them, right? One of the big issues as these systems become more and more AI driven, if what administrators do because it's old fashioned or they're used to it or it's easy is the same thing as what a hacker does, well, how's the system really going to tell the difference? Because technically you shouldn't be doing it that way anyway.
You turn on something simple like, not simple, but if you have MSE3 or Azure Premium 1 and you turn on ATA on your environment, it's going to catch bad administrator practices as much as anything.
Correct. Yeah. Typically, it catches bad administrative processes. So that's typically what it's going to catch. And that's good because it makes you clean up, makes you do things the proper way it should be done now. And then if you do that, you become more and more bulletproof in the environment. So for example, I should not be able to compromise a machine and then suddenly have the local admin credentials for every machine on the network. That's a bad practice. But it exists a lot, and the larger the environment, the more often it exists. And so that's why we say that you have to basically trust nothing, and you have to validate and verify, because that's where you're going to catch that.
So what would the CIO do? So he doesn't have 45 different conversations with people. What technology could he use that is potentially free with and give a tremendous amount of data, just practices? Because I mean, that was the whole theme of the RSA conference this year, was called the insider threat. And it's funny, that word insider threat, it's like, I think people are doing things they don't necessarily think are threat worthy all the time, but we do have some people that are coming in as bad and as good, but all these tools get mixed up together and you're really not sure who's bad and who's good. So
Right.
how could a CIO say, do this? I want the report next week.
I mean, one of the good ways is get rid of half the solutions you got. Because what we find, the more stuff you have, the more it has to be managed, the more complicated it is.
Mhm.
So if you get into a framework that actually communicates, or you reduce your kind of solution sprawl into a few subsets, you can actually do what you're talking about, which is have a good audit of it, have a good validation of it. But if you there was a time where people talked about defense in layers, and they have so many layers that they have no defense anymore. Because the only way to make it work is basically to tunnel through every single layer. We've run into environments where people have 3 different flavors of firewalls stacked one after the other, and they're all open because it was impossible to make anything work in a reasonable manner. And so that's one of the things. You bought $500,000 worth of firewalls, but they effectively do nothing because it was so complicated it couldn't be handled. So if a CIO wants to be able to say that, the first thing to look at is what solutions do I get rid of, and what solutions do nothing versus actively do something. Because from our point of view, it's one thing to say, okay, we can see 90% of what happened. It's another thing to say, I can block 85% of what may happen. I'd rather block that 85%. Get it out of there so that whatever's watching in the background, whether you call it threat hunting, seeing what have you, only has that 15% left to really play with. Otherwise, your signal to noise ratio is just really off the charts, and the box will either just be noisy as heck. And if I remember correctly, that's what happened in that Target hack. Was people were complaining the SIEM systems were so noisy that no one could actually really do anything with it.
So that's
It doesn't help.
so the noise and the telemetry, all the data. So part of the reason you're saying limit the tooling, limit your security tooling, is because it's going to spew out less noise. You can find more of the signal within the noise because you're not going to have confusion amongst multiple systems. And that's part of that is a challenge now, is limiting the tooling to the fewest amount of vendors possible, not only to keep the costs down, but to be able to actually do useful work without the guys going into every single console. And so from a blocking perspective, one of the reasons we like the Sonic Wall is because we can actually have a security center which is pinging when there's endpoints that are compromised. I like it because it's a less is more. It's a Pareto principle approach to security. Where do you see that this is going to force people to look at that more closely right now?
I mean, I would hope so. Especially as the employees get out of the data center, that also means some of those systems are even less effective because the people aren't there. So now there's the question of, if people are going to stay working from home or stay distributed, the ROI on that keeps dropping. And so if you have a system that can really only be helpful when everyone's in the office, do you keep paying for it? What do you really want to do with it? So I think they have to look at it from that aspect. We always think people should look at it because when we do our reviews or assessments and scoreboards, what we really find is that the more solutions someone has, almost guaranteed, the less actual security they've got. Because it's just too hard to maintain all of that raw maintenance requirement. And then in some cases, people really push it out to, let's say, a third-party vendor who is doing kind of a lower value management of it. Well, what we find there is that they're scared to turn on all the security in these systems. So even though the box could do 100 different things, they're only comfortable with it turning on 30, 40 of those 100. So you're not getting the value there either, because they've got to keep their overhead low. They've got to make sure that they don't get millions of calls because something might be quote unquote hard. And so I think you really have to look at that, because the fewer solutions you have, the more you can get to a higher value management of it, whether it's internal or external.
Yeah, we put together a stacking. Thanks, Raphael. Thanks, Shannon. Is Raphael going to call in?
That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, Raphael. No more texting. Call in. We're waiting for your call, and no softball questions either.
So there'd be no sports on this one.
This is going to turn into a happy hour pretty soon.
Still getting over Jerry Jones making picks by himself.
Well,
Be quiet.
I'm still a little upset with Brady leaving. Raphael, how are you?
So this is me. You're asking me to call you, so I call you.
Well, listen, you are. It's so great to hear your voice. And are you healthy during this time period?
We are healthy. The family is healthy. Friends are healthy. So it's great.
Well, fantastic. Well, I appreciate you calling in. And is there any particular question you wanted to throw out there?
Yes. I have a more strategic question as it relates to when we start coming back to the office. What is the role that you see CIO playing in the planning of organizations coming back? I am very involved in that with the CIO, ensuring that we have a plan, that we have the proper protocols, that we're thinking about who needs to come back first, who can stay from working from home, what are the supplies that we need to come back to the office so people can feel safe. When do we put those orders in? Because as you know, the supply chain is having problems. So if you wait the last minute to start putting orders in, you're not going to have anything you need to be able to come back. Who comes back in terms of, are you bringing the low risk people back? How do you determine that? Are you using any kind of technologies to, for example, detect high fevers or things of that nature so people can do a scan when they come in, and if they have a fever, they can go home? Things like that. So overall, what are you seeing out there? What are the roles that you think we should be playing in planning for organizations to come back when that time comes?
Well, one of the things.
Hold on one quick second. So I just want to reiterate, just to make sure everybody heard that question. So your question is very much on the strategy side is in the technical component, but I just want to make sure we heard this right. Your users, when they start coming back to your association, who comes back first? Who comes back second? What are the how do you measure whether the person is safe to come back or not? And then what's the role of the CIO in this whole process? And you've been working closely with your COO on that. I'm assuming your HR people as well. Do we understand your question?
That's correct. And then the protocols that you think we should be using, or what people think.
Yeah.
You want to take a shot?
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that we've heard so far is there has definitely been a real estate conversation of, do people still need the real estate? And as people are coming back, there's the question of, should they, and what should that environment look like? So at a higher level, we're hearing that. But at a technical level, there's actually a lot of concerns that are being raised where you don't necessarily know where that computer's been, who's been touching it, what else they're doing. Everyone's heard about all of the school issues with Google having issues with all the homeschooling and things like that. And these machines are on that network with all of these children's machines and tablets and what have you doing home learning. There's a really big risk there of what has that system been through. Now, if all of the different blocking mechanisms we talk about are in place, maybe you worry about it less and deal with it when it comes in. Otherwise, there really should be a really hardcore plan before you start letting mass amounts of people back in the office. How are you going to make sure things are clean? Mm-hmm. You know, the last thing that you want to do, because a lot of these malwares and hackers, they're smart. They know the difference between someone at home and someone in the office. They know the difference. And wouldn't it be horrible that you start bringing people back and at a 1 week time bomb of everybody being in the office and relaxing, ransomware that's been dormant for a couple of weeks, a couple of months, runs from the inside out? That would be pretty horrible there.
So can you put so traditional antivirus is out the door. There's just no way that's
out the door.
So let's just consider traditional antivirus done. So if you had OpenDNS, that will at least prevent you making sure that any DNS, your DNS users can't go anywhere and more damage from an infection. What can you put like an AI tool like a Capture Client at the endpoint or like CrowdStrike or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely Next-Gen AV, Capture Client, something with full sandboxing actually turned on. Most customers don't turn it on.
Okay. Well, why don't they turn it on?
Because it's a pain. and it causes help desk. Well, I mean, it causes help desk calls when
Yep.
it first gets initialized. People are busy. They don't want to deal with the fact that it's not one click and you're out, because realistically, no matter what marketing
Yeah.
says, none of those vendors are one click. It all takes a little bit of effort.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes back in the office, you mentioned AI. What's interesting about that, think of the threat management systems that are in. For the last few months, they now have a different learned behavior of what normal is.
I didn't
When,
think about
you
that.
got to think about it. So when these PCs start coming back, normal is now radically
It's
different.
a new normal.
It's a new normal. And so if you bring people back into the office and you think, well, I've got these AI systems I can rely on.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. It might be 6 months since that computer's been there. What's normal? You don't know. And so that's
Okay.
why there has to be thought there too, because you also don't want to be the CIO that when people start coming back in the office, all of a sudden, all of these fire alarms start going off left, right, and center, because all of these systems are triggering on things it hasn't seen in 6-7 months.
Yeah.
So that can be dangerous
Can you
as well.
deploy that kind of a tool to the endpoint that does a kind of a next-gen inspection without touching those machines?
You can. I mean, you could definitely do kind of that next gen AV style
Okay.
and do it. But keep in mind, some of the threat management, one of the things it's seeing is who's touching your environment.
Yeah.
So if we look at some of the recent compromises, at the end of the day, they are achieving admin access and they're using basically administrative tools against someone. You'll only see that when people come back into the office, right? So when they come back in and those computers start communicating, you suddenly have a big blind spot, and where you should be catching what's actually a bad actor, you won't necessarily, because everything has to relearn. So there definitely has to be a strategic plan of how do we let people back in the office? What systems that we rely on are we going to turn off, be quiet, let them relearn? What is that going to look like? Just once again, people are going to be nervous about coming back, and if the CIO is sitting there ringing the alarm bell every 5 seconds, there's going to be a zero trust, right? And to me, that's going to be almost a bigger issue going forward. Is when people are very nervous, if there's a severe lack of trust, how are you going to get that back? And then how are you going to implement the rest of the security tools that you need to actually make them safe?
Rafael, any follow-ups, or is that good? I think Rafael might have fallen off. No, he's still there. I might be on mute.
No, I'm sorry, I was on mute. No, I think I put my follow-up on the chat. Basically, we need to clean up in the physical world
I see
as
that.
well as the virtual world.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Great point. And I actually want to throw in, I want our listeners to play offense, not defense. Meaning that I want you to be so tight on how you're going to have defense figured out that you can lean in. This is going to need you to straddle all the departments, Rafa, and knowing you as how strong a leader you are, spending more of your time figuring out how to bring revenue, capture revenue, make customers happy, and work with the departments and such, and have a strong defense. But we don't want to skew that all of a sudden, 9 defense, 10 offense. I like 51-49.
And another thing to put on the strategy plan is assume people messed up and you need to go validate. So as an example, I saw a release this morning that there's a New York secure merchant processor for credit cards. They just lost $2.5 million, 2.5 million records of credit cards. And they're saying, oh, it's because of COVID and people were disparate and we forgot, right? Their job is protecting credit card numbers. Absolute failure. So imagine everyone's job who's not protecting credit card numbers, things like that. Everyone's distributed. Things are going to be showing up places they shouldn't be. Due diligence says you should really start looking at how do you figure out how bad it is, what got spread. Is it PII data? Is it California privacy data? Is it HIPAA credit card? Is it just internal payroll information that can get everyone's identity stolen that's now spread out all over who knows where? I think everyone from planning and in those executive discussions of what comes next, there really should be a plan in there that says, we've got to go crawl and look. We've got to go trust but verify and figure out, did this stuff get out and where is it? Because if the people who their sole job is to protect credit cards, as an example, mess up that flamboyantly, then what chance does everybody else have to come through it unscathed and perfect?
Rafael, you have a great day. Thank you for the call in.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for what you do. Please be safe.
We will. Thank you. Well, I want to get wrapped up here because James has to get on to another conversation. But Appreciate all of our listeners for listening in to us today. That was a great week 2 and great first time we're going live with this format, and I hope it's useful to everybody. We're going to those listeners that are here, we have a guide, an endpoint security guide that is a checklist of questions to ask regarding endpoints, and you'll be able to see a lot of this. Where as we're recording, we're going to break this into parts so you can consume it at your leisure, different sections here over the next couple weeks. So appreciate everybody very much for their time, and have a great rest of the day. Want to get you out of here before the end of lunch. Bye-bye.